Hey y'all, tonight we're diving into a fascinating journey through one of history's darkest yet most transformative periods. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake to the sound of coughing that echoes through the thin walls of your tenement building like a symphony of suffering, and the October morning air in Philadelphia carries the smell of carbolic acid and something else, something sweet and putrid that you've learned to associate with death, and you pull the threadbare blanket closer around your shoulders as you listen to Mrs. Kowalski in the apartment next door struggling to breathe, her rattling gasps punctuated by violent coughing fits that spray blood onto the walls you share, and you know that today marks the third week since the plague arrived in your neighborhood carried by soldiers returning from the Great War, and you understand that the invisible enemy that now stalks your streets is more deadly than any German artillery barrage. More merciless than any mustard gas attack, because this killer shows no preference for soldiers or civilians, young or old, rich or poor, and it moves through your community like wildfire through dry timber, consuming entire families in a matter of days. You are Margaret O'Brien, 24 years old, a seamstress in the garment district who sends half her meager wages to your parents' farm in County Cork, and you live in a single room on the 4th floor of a building that houses 47 souls, though that number changes daily as the flu claims its victims and new arrivals take the places of the dead, and you understand that in this city of nearly 2 million people, you are witnessing the collapse of everything that modern civilization had promised to protect you from: the return of medieval death rates in an age of electric lights and automobiles, the failure of medical science that had seemed so confident just months ago when doctors spoke of conquering disease through scientific progress and rational thought. The morning ritual of checking yourself for symptoms has become as automatic as breathing, and you run your hands along your neck feeling for the swollen lymph nodes that might signal the beginning of the end. You test your breathing for the telltale wheeze that precedes the violent coughing. You examine your fingernails for the blue tinge that marks oxygen starvation, and you try to ignore the persistent headache that has plagued you for 3 days, because headaches are common and stress can cause them, and admitting that you might be infected would mean accepting that your chances of seeing another month are perhaps 1 in 4, and you remember the morning 2 weeks ago when your roommate Catherine felt perfectly well at breakfast and was dead by midnight. Her body turning blue-black as her lungs filled with bloody foam and her heart stopped beating from the strain of fighting an infection that modern medicine could neither understand nor treat. The silence from Mrs. Kowalski's apartment tells you that her struggle ended sometime during the night, and you understand that this means another body will join the growing pile of corpses that overwhelms the city's morgues and funeral homes, another family destroyed by a disease that doctors call influenza but everyone knows is something far more terrible than any seasonal illness, and you remember learning that this plague has already killed more people in 6 months than the entire 4-year war in Europe, that whole cities have been abandoned as their populations fled in terror, that in some places the dead outnumber the living, and civilization itself seems to be crumbling under the weight of mass death and social collapse. And you think about the letters from home that stopped coming 3 weeks ago and wonder if your parents are still alive, or if the plague has reached rural Ireland with the same devastating effect it has had on every other place it has touched. The task of washing yourself in the basin of cold water that serves as your only bathing facility reminds you of how completely the normal infrastructure of city life has broken down, and you understand that hot water requires cold delivery, and cold delivery requires workers, and workers are either dead or too sick to work or too terrified to leave their homes, and you see evidence everywhere of the cascade failure that occurs when enough people die or become incapacitated that essential services simply stop functioning. And you remember the excitement you felt 2 years ago when you first arrived in Philadelphia with dreams of steady work and modern conveniences and the independence that city life promised to young women from traditional rural backgrounds. And how those dreams have been replaced by the daily struggle to avoid infection while watching everything around you collapse into chaos and despair. Your breakfast consists of a piece of stale bread and weak tea, because food distribution has become increasingly unreliable as truck drivers and shopkeepers succumb to the plague, and you understand that hunger is becoming almost as dangerous as the disease itself, because malnutrition weakens the immune system and makes people more susceptible to infection, creating a vicious cycle where the effects of social breakdown increase the death rate from the primary cause of that breakdown. And you remember the bread riots last week when desperate people stormed the few stores that remained open, and how 3 people were trampled to death in the panic. And you think about the irony that a city surrounded by farmland should face starvation because the systems for moving food from producers to consumers have been destroyed by a microscopic virus that weighs less than a grain of dust yet has brought the modern world to its knees. The decision about whether to leave your room and venture into the plague-infested streets requires calculating risks that no human being should have to contemplate, and you understand that staying inside means slowly starving while going outside means potential exposure to a disease that kills healthy adults in their prime with terrifying speed and efficiency, and you weigh your dwindling food supplies against the reports of violence and chaos that come from the few people brave enough to venture beyond their immediate neighborhoods, and you remember the stories of plague towns in medieval Europe where survivors barricaded themselves in their homes and waited for death to claim them. And you wonder if Philadelphia in 1918 represents humanity's progress beyond such dark times or merely the return of ancient terrors wearing modern clothes. The stairs leading down from your fourth-floor room creak under your feet with sounds that seem impossibly loud in the unnatural silence that has fallen over a building once filled with the noise of working families going about their daily routines, and you pass doors that you know conceal unspeakable horrors, entire families dead from the plague, bodies decomposing in rooms where no one dares to enter for fear of infection, and you understand that the sweet smell of decay that permeates the building represents the failure of all the social mechanisms that normally remove the dead and comfort the grieving. And you remember Mrs. Marconi on the second floor who lost her husband and 3 children in a single week and now sits by their bodies singing Italian lullabies in a voice cracked by grief and dehydration, and you think about the psychological toll that witnessing such devastation takes on the survivors and how trauma can be as debilitating as physical illness in determining who lives and who dies during a crisis of this magnitude. The street scene that greets you outside your building looks like something from a nightmare version of the bustling commercial district you remember from just a month ago, and you see abandoned carts filled with belongings from families who fled the city, dead horses that no one has the energy or equipment to remove, and scattered groups of hollow-eyed survivors moving through the streets like ghosts searching for something they can never find. And you understand that this devastation represents the complete breakdown of urban civilization when the death rate exceeds society's ability to cope with mass mortality, and you remember reading about the great plagues of history and thinking that such things belong to humanity's ignorant past, not to an age of scientific enlightenment and medical progress, and you realize that the confidence of modern civilization in its ability to control nature and protect human life was nothing more than hubris based on a few decades of relative success that have now been revealed as temporary reprieve rather than permanent victory. The few shops that remain open are guarded by armed men who view potential customers as threats rather than business opportunities, and you understand that commerce has reverted to its most primitive forms when social trust breaks down and every interaction becomes a potential life-or-death struggle, and you see how quickly the complex economic systems that support modern life can collapse when enough people become unable to participate in normal exchange relationships, and you remember the stories your grandmother told about the potato famine in Ireland and how people turned against their neighbors when starvation made cooperation impossible. And you think about the thin veneer of civilization that separates normal life from chaos and how easily that veneer can be stripped away by circumstances that overwhelm humanity's capacity for rational response and mutual support. The search for food takes you through neighborhoods that have become foreign territories where different rules apply and where survival depends on understanding dynamics that have nothing to do with the law or social convention, and you learn to read the signs that indicate which areas are controlled by armed gangs who shoot strangers on sight and which might still harbor remnants of legitimate authority, and you understand that the absence of effective government creates a vacuum that is filled by whoever has the weapons and willingness to use violence to control scarce resources, and you remember believing that such things only happened in backward countries where people hadn't learned to live according to civilized principles. And you see how quickly those principles disappear when the institutions that enforce them collapse under pressure that exceeds their capacity to maintain order and provide basic services that people need to survive. The line outside the Red Cross relief station stretches for 3 blocks and includes some of the most desperate people you have ever seen, and you take your place behind a woman holding a baby whose skin has the gray pallor that indicates severe malnutrition, and in front of an old man whose clothes mark him as middle class but whose hollow eyes and trembling hands reveal how completely the plague has destroyed his previous life. And you understand that disaster has the equalizing effect of reducing everyone to the same desperate struggle for basic necessities regardless of their previous social status or accumulated wealth, and you remember the society pages from newspapers just 6 months ago with their descriptions of elaborate parties and luxury goods. And you wonder what happened to those wealthy families and whether money provided any protection against a disease that seems to kill without regard for anything humans value or respect. The wait for relief supplies gives you time to observe how plague has changed human behavior in fundamental ways, and you see people maintaining distances from each other that would have seemed rude and antisocial just weeks ago. You watch interactions that are conducted through gestures and shouted instructions rather than normal conversation. You notice how everyone's eyes dart constantly, searching for signs of illness in others while trying to conceal their own symptoms, and you understand that the basic human need for social connection has been overruled by the more immediate need for physical survival, creating isolation that compounds the trauma of watching society collapse around you. And you remember the community gatherings and social events that gave meaning to life beyond mere survival, and you think about how the fear of infection has poisoned even the most basic human relationships and made every encounter with another person a potential death sentence. The relief supplies, when you finally reach the distribution point, consist of a single can of beans and a loaf of bread that must last you 3 days, and you understand that this represents the best effort of overwhelmed authorities who are trying to prevent complete social collapse while lacking the resources to address the scale of need created by mass death and economic disruption. And you see the impossible choices that officials must make when deciding how to allocate supplies that are inadequate for everyone and how to maintain some semblance of order when normal law enforcement has been decimated by the same plague that is killing everyone else. And you remember the confidence that government officials expressed just months ago about their ability to handle any crisis through proper planning and scientific management, and you realize that no amount of planning could have prepared society for a disaster that kills the planners faster than they can be replaced. The journey back to your tenement building requires navigating streets that have become increasingly dangerous as desperate people resort to violence to obtain resources they need for survival, and you clutch your meager food supplies while trying to appear invisible to the groups of men who eye every passerby as a potential victim. And you understand that the social contract that normally prevents such predatory behavior has been dissolved by circumstances that make cooperation seem less important than immediate self-preservation, and you remember feeling safe walking these same streets just months ago when police patrols and social expectations created an environment where violence was rare and usually punished. And you see how quickly civilization can revert to something resembling a state of nature where strength and cunning matter more than law or moral principles that depend on stable institutions for their enforcement. The sight of smoke rising from several buildings in your neighborhood tells you that fire has joined disease as a threat to whatever remains of normal life, and you understand that firefighting requires organized crews and working equipment and water pressure that depends on systems maintained by people who are either dead or too sick to work. And you remember learning about the great fires of history and how they often followed plagues because weakened societies could not mount effective responses to additional disasters, and you think about the cascade effects that multiply the impact of any single catastrophe when it overwhelms society's capacity to maintain the complex systems that modern life depends on. And you see evidence of how quickly urban environments can become uninhabitable when the infrastructure that supports millions of people breaks down completely. The return to your room provides temporary refuge from the chaos outside, but you understand that safety is relative when you're surrounded by infected people in a building with no heat, no reliable water supply, and no way to dispose of the dead, and you try to calculate how long your food will last while knowing that venturing outside again will expose you to increasing dangers. And you remember the excitement you felt when you first moved to the city and how urban life seemed to offer unlimited opportunities for someone willing to work hard and follow the rules, and you see how completely those opportunities have disappeared as the city itself dies around you, leaving only the struggle to survive each day while hoping that some remnant of civilization will survive the plague and provide a foundation for rebuilding what has been lost. The afternoon hours pass with agonizing slowness as you listen to the sounds of a city in its death throes, the constant coughing that comes through the walls, the occasional screams of people who have discovered dead family members, the sporadic gunfire from streets where armed groups fight over resources, and you understand that these sounds represent the collapse of everything that distinguished modern urban life from the brutality and chaos that characterized human existence in darker ages. And you remember believing that progress was inevitable and that each generation would live better than the one before. And you think about how naive such beliefs seem when confronted with evidence that civilization is far more fragile than anyone imagined and that all human achievements can be undone by forces beyond our control or understanding. The task of rationing your food requires making calculations that feel like life or death decisions because they probably are, and you divide your meager supplies into portions that might sustain you for 3 days while knowing that 3 days might be optimistic if relief distribution becomes even more irregular, and you understand that starvation might kill you before the plague has a chance, creating the bitter irony that survival could depend on maintaining your health just long enough to die from something else, and you remember the abundance you took for granted just weeks ago when food was available at any hour and your biggest worry was having enough money to buy what you wanted rather than wondering whether any food would be available at any price. And you think about the psychological adaptation required to accept that every meal might be your last and every day survived represents victory against overwhelming odds. The evening light filtering through your single window illuminates a room that has become your entire world, and you understand that this small space represents both prison and sanctuary in a city where leaving means risking death but staying means accepting isolation that could drive you insane, and you see how the plague has reduced human existence to its most basic elements, the simple struggle to breathe and eat and avoid infection while maintaining enough sanity to continue functioning, and you remember the dreams and ambitions that brought you to Philadelphia and how trivial they seem compared to the immediate challenge of surviving until tomorrow. And you think about the millions of people facing similar circumstances in cities around the world and how this shared experience of terror and loss might change humanity forever, creating either greater compassion through shared suffering or greater brutality through the normalization of mass death. The night sounds that penetrate your room include new horrors that mark the progression of social collapse, the howling of abandoned dogs that are slowly starving, the occasional crash of breaking glass as desperate people loot empty buildings, the crying of children who don't understand why their parents won't wake up, and you understand that these sounds represent the breakdown of all the systems that normally protect the vulnerable and maintain public order, and you remember the confidence that public officials expressed about their ability to maintain essential services during any conceivable emergency, and you realize that no one had conceived of an emergency that would kill the officials themselves along with most of the people they were supposed to protect, leaving behind a city full of strangers united only by their shared terror and desperation. The attempts to sleep while surrounded by such horror require a kind of mental discipline that you never knew you possessed, and you practice breathing exercises and mental imagery that help you escape temporarily from the reality of your situation, and you understand that psychological survival might be as important as physical health in determining who lives through this catastrophe and who succumbs to despair that makes fighting seem pointless, and you remember reading about soldiers who survived brutal battles by developing the ability to disconnect their minds from unbearable circumstances, and you think about the human capacity for adaptation that allows people to function even in situations that would have seemed impossible to endure just days or weeks earlier. And you see how quickly what seems abnormal becomes routine when it represents the only available option for continued existence. The dreams that come when you finally fall asleep blend memories of normal life with the nightmare reality of plague-ravaged Philadelphia, and you dream of family dinners and social gatherings that now seem like impossible luxuries, of streets filled with healthy people going about ordinary business, of a world where death was rare enough to be shocking rather than so common that it barely registers, and you understand that these dreams serve as psychological refuges that help maintain your sanity. By preserving memories of what life was like before the plague destroyed everything familiar and comforting, and you remember learning that people can survive almost anything if they can maintain hope that their suffering will eventually end. And you think about the importance of believing that this catastrophe is temporary even when all evidence suggests that the world you knew may be gone forever, and that whatever emerges from this disaster will be fundamentally different from anything that came before. The morning light reveals another day of the same impossible choices and calculated risks that have defined your existence since the plague transformed your city into a place where death is more common than life, and you begin the daily ritual of checking for symptoms while knowing that symptom checking has become meaningless because the disease can kill before symptoms appear and because medical care is unavailable even for those who recognize their condition early, and you understand that survival has become primarily a matter of luck rather than preparation or intelligent decision-making, creating a sense of helplessness that is almost as dangerous as the disease itself, because people who believe their actions don't matter often stop taking the precautions that might save their lives. The sound of shouting from the street draws you to your window, where you see a group of men in military uniforms attempting to restore some semblance of order to your neighborhood, and you understand that martial law represents both hope for protection and the admission that civilian authority has completely collapsed, and you watch as soldiers try to organize the removal of bodies while maintaining distances that protect them from infection, and you see how the very people sent to help are afraid. of the people they're supposed to protect, creating a situation where rescue efforts become exercises in mutual suspicion and fear rather than cooperation based on shared humanity and common purpose. And you remember believing that military intervention could solve any problem if properly organized and adequately resourced, and you realize that even military discipline and organization are inadequate when confronted with an enemy that cannot be fought with conventional weapons or defeated through traditional strategy. The decision about whether to approach the soldiers for help requires weighing the potential benefits of official assistance against the risks of exposing yourself to people who might be infected or who might view civilians as threats to be eliminated rather than citizens to be protected. And you understand that the breakdown of normal social relationships has made every human interaction potentially dangerous even when the other person is supposedly there to help you, and you remember the trust that people once placed in authorities and institutions that were presumed to have citizens' best interests at heart. And you see how quickly that trust disappears when institutions prove unable to function effectively and when their representatives seem more concerned with their own survival than with the welfare of the people they're supposed to serve, creating a situation where everyone becomes a potential enemy and cooperation becomes almost impossible to achieve. The soldiers' efforts to organize body removal reveal the staggering scale of death that has overwhelmed all normal methods of dealing with mortality, and you watch as they stack corpses like cordwood onto wagons that will transport them to mass graves dug by prisoners and desperate men who need the work despite the obvious health risks. And you understand that this industrial approach to death represents the complete breakdown of all the customs and rituals that normally help communities cope with loss and maintain respect for human dignity, and you remember the elaborate funeral ceremonies that once marked individual deaths and how the community would gather to support grieving families. And you think about how the plague has made death so common that individual lives have lost their significance and people have become mere statistics in a disaster too large for human comprehension or emotional processing. The afternoon brings news shouted from street to street by people brave enough to venture beyond their immediate neighborhoods, and you learn that the plague has spread to every major city in the country and that some rural areas have been completely depopulated, that the government in Washington has effectively ceased to function because too many officials have died or fled, that other countries are refusing to allow American ships or travelers to enter their territories, and you understand that this disaster has isolated your entire nation and possibly destroyed it as a functioning society, and you remember the pride you felt in American institutions and achievements just months ago when the country seemed destined to lead the world into a new age of prosperity and democracy. And you see how quickly national power and influence can disappear when the people who create and maintain them are eliminated by forces that show no respect for human ambition or political boundaries. The reports from other cities describe scenes that make Philadelphia's situation seem almost manageable by comparison, and you hear about places where the dead outnumber the living by 10 to 1, where survivors have abandoned cities entirely rather than try to maintain them, where gangs of armed men control all resources and kill anyone who challenges their authority. And you understand that the variety of responses to the plague reflects different breaking points in social organization rather than fundamental differences between populations, and you remember reading about the collapse of ancient civilizations and wondering how people could have allowed their societies to disintegrate so completely. And you realize that you are witnessing exactly such a collapse and that it requires no special weakness or failure of character, merely circumstances that exceed any society's capacity to adapt and respond effectively to unprecedented challenges. The evening meal of carefully rationed food provides an opportunity to reflect on how completely your understanding of normal life has changed in just a few weeks, and you eat your small portion of bread while thinking about the elaborate meals you once enjoyed and how the simple act of consuming adequate nutrition has become a daily victory rather than an assumption too basic to deserve conscious thought. And you understand that the plague has revealed how many things you took for granted were actually precious privileges that depended on complex systems maintained by thousands of people whose work you never noticed until they were no longer alive to perform it. And you remember complaining about food quality or service that now seems incredibly ungrateful given how many people would consider your current rations a feast, and you think about the psychological adjustment required to find satisfaction in mere survival when you once had expectations of comfort, entertainment, and personal fulfillment that now seem like impossible luxuries. The task of maintaining personal hygiene without adequate water or soap becomes an exercise in improvisation that reminds you constantly of how thoroughly modern conveniences have disappeared, and you use precious water sparingly while trying to stay clean enough to avoid infections that could weaken your resistance to the plague. And you understand that the simple act of washing has become a complex calculation involving resource conservation, health maintenance, and psychological well-being that depends on feeling somewhat human despite circumstances that seem designed to reduce people to their most animal survival instincts, and you remember taking hot baths for granted and how relaxing they seemed compared to the anxious efficiency that now characterizes every aspect of personal care. And you think about the cumulative effect of small discomforts and deprivations that make survival more difficult even when they don't directly threaten life, and you see how the breakdown of infrastructure affects every aspect of human existence rather than just the most obvious needs like food and shelter. The question of whether to attempt contact with other survivors in your building requires balancing the human need for companionship against the very real risk that other people represent sources of infection, and you listen to the sounds from other apartments trying to determine who might still be alive and healthy enough to maintain some form of communication, and you understand that isolation is both protection and torture in a situation where social connection could mean either mutual support or mutual destruction, and you remember the community that once existed in your building where neighbors knew each other's names and shared small kindnesses that made urban living tolerable. And you think about how fear has poisoned those relationships and made every other person a potential threat rather than a potential friend, creating loneliness that compounds all the other stresses of survival and makes the struggle to stay alive seem even more hopeless and meaningless. The gradual realization that you might be one of the few survivors in your immediate area brings a mixture of relief and terror as you understand that survival could mean winning a lottery that most people lose, and you consider the possibility that the plague might burn itself out simply by killing most of the people it can infect, leaving behind scattered survivors who must somehow rebuild civilization from whatever remains of the previous world, and you think about the enormous responsibility that would fall on people like yourself who lack the knowledge or resources to maintain complex systems but who might be called upon to preserve whatever can be saved of human achievement and culture. And you remember stories of previous dark ages when knowledge was lost because too few people survived who understood it well enough to pass it on to future generations, and you wonder whether you are witnessing the beginning of such a period and whether anything meaningful will survive to help future generations avoid repeating the mistakes that led to this catastrophe. The physical symptoms that you've been trying to ignore finally force you to confront the possibility that you have contracted the plague despite all your precautions, and you feel the fever beginning to build behind your eyes and the scratchy sensation in your throat that could be the first sign of the respiratory infection that kills most victims, and you understand that this moment represents the transition from observer to victim in a tragedy that you've been watching unfold around you for weeks, and you remember the other people whose symptoms began exactly like yours and who were dead within days. And you think about whether you have enough strength left to continue fighting or whether you should simply accept what seems inevitable and try to die with whatever dignity is possible under such circumstances, and you see how the approach of death clarifies priorities and makes previous concerns seem trivial compared to the simple question of whether you want to keep struggling when struggle might be futile. The decision to continue fighting the illness rather than surrendering to it represents a choice between hope and despair that will determine not just whether you live or die but how you spend whatever time remains to you, and you understand that maintaining the will to survive requires believing that your life has meaning beyond mere biological existence and that the suffering you're enduring serves some purpose larger than individual self-preservation, and you remember the people who died fighting the disease and how their struggle inspired others to keep trying even when the odds seemed hopeless. And you think about the responsibility you have to honor their memory by refusing to give up even when giving up would be easier and perhaps more rational than continuing to endure pain and uncertainty with no guarantee of success, and you see how the human capacity for hope can persist even in circumstances that provide no logical basis for optimism, and how that capacity might be what distinguishes human beings from other animals that simply accept death when it becomes inevitable. The progression of symptoms over the following days provides a first-hand education in how the plague destroys human bodies, and you experience the fever that makes thinking difficult, the respiratory distress that makes breathing and conscious effort, the weakness that makes even simple movements exhausting, and you understand that recovery will require not just surviving the infection but rebuilding physical strength that has been completely depleted by the illness, and you remember taking good health for granted and how effortless normal functioning seemed when your body worked properly without requiring constant attention and willpower. And you think about the people who have survived the plague only to die from complications or secondary infections because their bodies were too weakened to fight off additional challenges, and you see how survival depends not just on defeating the primary disease but on maintaining enough resilience to handle whatever other problems might arise during the slow process of recovery. The hallucinations that come with high fever blur the line between reality and nightmare, and you experience visions of the dead rising from their graves to reclaim the city, of angels and demons fighting over the souls of plague victims, of your family in Ireland calling to you across the ocean, and you understand that these experiences represent your mind's attempt to process trauma that exceeds normal human capacity for comprehension, and you remember learning that people often have religious or mystical experiences during near-death situations, and that these visions might serve important psychological functions even if they have no basis in external reality. And you think about the meaning that people find in suffering and how the search for significance can help humans endure experiences that would otherwise destroy their sanity or their will to live, and you see how the approach of death can clarify spiritual questions that seemed unimportant during normal life but become essential when facing the possibility that individual existence might end completely. The slow return of rational thinking as your fever begins to break provides hope that you might be among the minority who survive the plague, and you feel the first clear thoughts you've had in days, while understanding that recovery is far from certain and that many people die during the convalescent period when their weakened bodies succumb to complications or secondary infections, and you begin the careful process of assessing what damage the illness has done to your system while trying not to exert yourself beyond your severely limited capacity, and you remember reading that plague survivors often suffer permanent health problems that affect their ability to work or function normally. And you think about the possibility that survival might mean living as an invalid rather than returning to the life you had before, and you see how the definition of victory changes when the stakes involve basic survival rather than achievement or happiness or any of the goals that seemed important before the plague transformed your understanding of what matters in human existence. The gradual improvement in your condition over the following week provides daily lessons in how completely the plague has changed everything about your life and your world, and you discover that your physical strength has been so depleted that climbing the stairs to your room requires rest stops, that your appetite has disappeared despite weeks of inadequate nutrition, that your emotional responses have been flattened in ways that make it difficult to feel joy or sadness or any of the normal human reactions to experience, and you understand that plague survival involves psychological as well as physical recovery, and that the process of returning to normal functioning might take months or years if it's possible at all. And you remember the person you were before the plague and wonder if that person still exists somewhere inside your damaged body and traumatized mind, or if the experience has changed you so fundamentally that recovery means becoming someone entirely different rather than returning to your previous self. The first venture outside your room since becoming ill reveals how much the neighborhood has changed during your period of illness, and you see that most buildings now stand empty, that the streets are littered with debris and abandoned possessions, that the few people still moving about have the hollow-eyed look of survivors who have seen too much death and suffered too much loss to ever be completely normal again, and you understand that the plague has created a community of damaged people who share the experience of surviving something that killed most of their neighbors and destroyed everything familiar about their previous lives. And you remember the bustling commercial district that existed just months ago and how full of life and energy it seemed compared to the ghost town that now surrounds you, and you think about the enormous effort that will be required to rebuild even the most basic services, and whether enough people have survived with the necessary skills and knowledge to make such reconstruction possible. The search for other survivors becomes a priority as you realize that isolation might be as dangerous as infection for people trying to rebuild their lives in a world where all normal social structures have collapsed, and you listen for sounds of human activity while being careful not to expose yourself to unnecessary risks from people who might be desperate enough to view other survivors as threats rather than potential allies, and you understand that the plague has created conditions where cooperation is essential for survival, but where trust has become almost impossible because everyone represents a potential source of danger. And you remember the social bonds that once made urban life tolerable, and how quickly those bonds can be destroyed by circumstances that make mutual aid seem less important than self-preservation, and you think about the psychological barriers that must be overcome before survivors can begin working together to create new communities from the ruins of the old world. The discovery of a small group of survivors who have been maintaining an informal support network provides hope that social cooperation might be possible even under post-plague conditions, and you meet people who have found ways to share resources and information while maintaining the cautious distances that survival requires, and you understand that these relationships represent the beginning of whatever new society might emerge from the catastrophe, and you see how the shared experience of surviving impossible circumstances can create bonds that are in some ways stronger than the casual associations that characterize normal social life. And you remember learning that disasters sometimes bring out the best in human nature as well as the worst, and that communities forged by shared suffering can develop levels of cooperation and mutual support that peacetime societies rarely achieve. And you think about the possibility that plague survivors might create something better than what existed before rather than simply trying to recreate the world that the disease destroyed. The process of establishing new social norms for a community of plague survivors requires negotiating between the need for cooperation and the equally important need for maintaining health precautions that might prevent future outbreaks. And you participate in discussions about how to share food and shelter while minimizing the risk of spreading infection, how to make decisions collectively when traditional authority structures no longer exist, how to handle conflicts without resorting to violence that could destroy the fragile bonds holding the group together. And you understand that these conversations represent the foundation of whatever new civilization might eventually emerge from the ruins of the old one. And you remember reading about how societies have rebuilt themselves after previous catastrophes and how the lessons learned during the recovery process often determine whether the new society avoids the mistakes that contributed to the original disaster. And you think about the responsibility that survivors have to create something worthy of the suffering that brought them together and the sacrifice of all the people who died during the plague years. The slow expansion of your survivor community as new people are discovered or as refugees arrive from other devastated areas provides opportunities to learn how the plague affected different parts of the city and region. And you hear stories of places where civilization collapsed completely and others where remnants of government or military organization managed to maintain some semblance of order. And you understand that the recovery process will vary enormously depending on local conditions and the particular combination of people and resources that survived in each area. And you see how the plague has created a patchwork of different survival strategies and social experiments that might provide models for larger reconstruction efforts if communication and travel between communities can be re-established. And you remember the confidence that people once placed in large-scale institutions and wonder whether future society will be organized around smaller, more resilient communities that can survive local disasters without depending on complex systems that prove vulnerable to catastrophic failure. The gradual re-establishment of basic services like food distribution and medical care requires improvisation and adaptation that reveals how little most people understood about the systems that supported their daily lives. And you learn to perform tasks that were once handled by specialists who died during the plague. And you understand that survival requires developing a much broader range of skills than were necessary when complex social division of labor allowed people to focus on narrow specialties. And you see how the breakdown of specialization has both positive and negative effects, creating more self-reliant individuals but also reducing the efficiency and sophistication that specialization makes possible. And you remember taking for granted services that now seem miraculous in their complexity and wonder whether future society will be able to recreate them or whether the plague has permanently reduced human capabilities to a simpler but perhaps more sustainable level of organization. The psychological work of processing the trauma of plague survival proves to be as difficult and important as the physical work of rebuilding infrastructure. And you participate in informal support groups where people share their experiences and try to make sense of what they've witnessed and endured. And you understand that mental health is essential for effective community building and that survivors who cannot cope with their trauma often become disruptive influences that threaten group cohesion. And you see how the plague has affected everyone differently depending on their previous life experiences, their personality characteristics, and the specific losses they suffered. And you remember believing that people should be able to simply put traumatic experiences behind them and move on with their lives. And you realize that the scale of loss and horror that plague survivors have experienced cannot be processed quickly or easily, and that healing will require years of patient work and mutual support from people who understand what others have endured because they have endured it themselves. The attempts to re-establish contact with the outside world reveal how completely the plague has disrupted not just local communities but entire regional and national networks of communication and transportation. And you learn that many cities have been completely abandoned, that rail lines have been destroyed or fallen into disrepair, that telegraph systems no longer function because the people who maintain them are dead. And you understand that the isolation you've experienced locally is part of a much larger breakdown that has fragmented the country into scattered pockets of survivors who may not even know that other communities still exist. And you remember taking for granted the ability to communicate instantly across vast distances and to travel freely between cities and regions. And you think about how the loss of those capabilities has reduced human society to something resembling medieval conditions where information travels only as fast as people can walk and where communities are truly isolated from each other for months or years at a time. The seasonal changes that mark the passage of time provide a natural rhythm for recovery efforts, and you participate in planning for winter that must account for greatly reduced resources and the absence of many services that survivors took for granted even during the worst of the plague. And you understand that surviving the disease was only the first challenge, and that surviving the aftermath may prove equally difficult as communities struggle to maintain themselves without the infrastructure and expertise that modern life requires. And you see how the plague has forced survivors to rediscover skills and knowledge that were common in previous generations but had been largely forgotten as people became dependent on complex technological and social systems. And you remember your grandmother's stories about self-sufficient farming communities and wonder whether such communities represent the future rather than the past. And you think about the possibility that the plague has forced humanity to step backward technologically in order to create more sustainable and resilient ways of organizing society. The first winter after the plague tests every aspect of the survivor community's resilience and organizational capabilities, and you experience shortages of fuel and food that make survival a daily challenge despite months of preparation and resource accumulation. And you understand that the margin between life and death remains extremely thin even for people who have successfully navigated the immediate crisis of the disease itself. And you see how the community must balance individual needs against collective welfare in situations where there truly isn't enough for everyone and where wrong decisions could doom the entire group. And you remember the abundance that existed before the plague and how wasteful it seems in retrospect compared to the careful conservation that now characterizes every aspect of daily life. And you think about whether such conservation represents a temporary necessity that will be abandoned when abundance returns, or a permanent change in human behavior that might prevent future catastrophes by reducing the strain that human activities place on natural systems. The spring that follows brings the first real hope that recovery might be possible, and you watch as small groups of survivors begin to venture beyond their immediate neighborhoods to establish contact with other communities and to search for resources that might support larger populations. And you understand that the expansion of social connections beyond the immediate survival group represents a crucial step in rebuilding civilization. And you see how the lessons learned during the plague years have created survivors who are both more cautious about trusting others and more appreciative of human cooperation when it can be achieved safely. And you remember the casual way that people once took social relationships for granted, and how much more precious such relationships seem when they have been earned through shared struggle and mutual support during impossible circumstances. And you think about how the plague might have permanently changed human nature by selecting for people who combine self-reliance with the ability to cooperate effectively under stress. The gradual re-establishment of trade relationships between survivor communities marks another milestone in the recovery process, and you participate in negotiations about exchanging surplus food for manufactured goods or trading skilled labor for raw materials that cannot be produced locally. And you understand that these economic relationships represent the foundation for whatever new civilization will emerge from the plague years. And you see how the breakdown and reconstruction of economic systems provides opportunities to address some of the inequalities and inefficiencies that characterized the pre-plague world. And you remember learning about how previous catastrophes sometimes led to social reforms that improve conditions for ordinary people. And you think about whether plague survivors might create economic arrangements that are more equitable and sustainable than what existed before, or whether human nature will eventually recreate the same problems that contributed to the fragility of the old system. The stories that emerge about plague survival in different communities reveal the enormous variety of human responses to catastrophic circumstances. And you hear about places where survivors created highly organized cooperative societies, and others where individuals or small groups maintained independence through superior resources or strategic advantages. And you understand that the plague has served as a kind of natural experiment in social organization that demonstrates the range of possibilities for human community building. And you see how different survival strategies have produced different types of post-plague societies that might serve as models or warnings for other recovering communities. And you remember reading about utopian communities in American history and wonder whether some plague survivor settlements might achieve the kind of social harmony that proved elusive under normal circumstances. And you think about how shared trauma and the necessity of cooperation for survival might provide the foundation for more successful community building than was possible when people had the luxury of pursuing individual interests without regard for collective welfare. The emergence of new cultural traditions and practices among plague survivors reflects the human need to find meaning in suffering and to create rituals that help process collective trauma, and you participate in memorial services that honor the dead while celebrating the resilience of the living, and you see how these ceremonies serve both emotional and social functions by reinforcing group identity and shared values that distinguish survivor communities from the competitive individualism that characterized pre-plague society, and you understand that culture is not just entertainment or decoration but an essential element of community building that helps people maintain cooperation and mutual support even when immediate survival pressures have been reduced. And you remember the cultural events and traditions that gave meaning to life before the plague and how different they seem compared to the more serious and purposeful celebrations that have emerged among survivors, and you think about how catastrophic experiences can strip away superficial aspects of culture while strengthening the fundamental human needs for meaning, connection, and shared identity that help communities survive over long periods. The question of whether to have children in the post-plague world becomes a central concern for survivors who must balance the human drive to reproduce against the uncertainty about what kind of world they would be bringing children into, and you listen to debates about whether plague survivors have a responsibility to rebuild human population or whether the planet might be better off with fewer people making smaller demands on natural resources, and you understand that these discussions reflect deeper questions about the purpose of human existence and the value of civilization that the plague has forced everyone to confront. And you see how the experience of mass death has made some people more determined to preserve and continue human life while making others question whether human survival is worth the cost in suffering that it seems to require. And you remember the confidence that people once had about progress and the future, and how that confidence has been replaced by a more modest and uncertain hope that survival might be possible if people learn to live more carefully and cooperatively than they did before. The plague destroyed the illusion of unlimited growth and technological solutions to fundamental problems. The children who are born into post-plague communities grow up with a very different understanding of life than previous generations possessed, and you watch them develop survival skills and social awareness that seem both advanced and limited compared to the education that children received in the pre-plague world. And you understand that these children represent both hope for human continuity and anxiety about whether the knowledge and values that survivors consider important can be transmitted effectively to people who have no personal memory of normal civilization, and you see how the plague has created a generation gap that is more profound than anything in previous human history, separating those who remember the old world from those who know only the new reality. And you remember your own childhood and how sheltered and innocent it seems compared to the harsh education that post-plague children receive, and you think about whether the greater realism and survival skills that these children develop compensate for their loss of the optimism and broader cultural knowledge that characterized education in more stable times. The gradual rebuilding of educational institutions reflects the survivor community's commitment to preserving and transmitting human knowledge despite the enormous practical challenges that such efforts entail, and you participate in planning schools that must operate without many of the resources and assumptions that supported education in the pre-plague world, and you understand that teaching children in post-plague communities requires focusing on practical skills and essential knowledge while finding ways to preserve cultural and intellectual traditions that might seem less immediately relevant to survival, and you see how the plague has forced educators to reconsider fundamental questions about what children need to learn and how learning can be organized most effectively. And you remember the elaborate educational system that existed before the plague and how much of it now seems irrelevant or inefficient compared to the more focused and practical approach that survival necessities have created. And you think about whether post-plague education might actually be superior to what came before by eliminating unnecessary complexity and concentrating on knowledge and skills that truly matter for human flourishing. The religious and spiritual responses to the plague reveal how catastrophic experiences can both strengthen and challenge traditional beliefs, and you observe communities where shared suffering has reinforced faith and created deeper spiritual bonds alongside others where the scale of seemingly meaningless death has led to widespread religious skepticism or the development of entirely new belief systems. And you understand that the plague has served as a test of every major religious and philosophical tradition, forcing believers to explain why a good God would allow such suffering or why rational progress failed so completely to protect human welfare. And you see how the answers that different communities have developed to these questions influence their approaches to recovery and their visions of what kind of society they want to create. And you remember the confident secularism that characterized much of pre-plague intellectual life and how naive it seems in retrospect compared to the more humble and uncertain spirituality that has emerged among survivors who have witnessed the complete failure of human institutions and scientific Confidence to prevent catastrophe. The ongoing health challenges that affect many plague survivors create new categories of disability and dependence that post-plague communities must learn to accommodate, and you work with people whose respiratory systems were permanently damaged by the disease, whose cognitive abilities were affected by high fevers, whose emotional stability was compromised by traumatic experiences, and you understand that recovery involves not just rebuilding physical infrastructure but also creating social systems that can support people whose needs exceed what individual families or small groups can provide, and you see how the plague has created a generation of survivors who require ongoing care while also possessing valuable experience and knowledge that communities cannot afford to waste. And you remember the medical system that existed before the plague and how inadequate it seems compared to the more holistic approach to health and disability that survivor communities have been forced to develop through necessity and mutual aid. The environmental changes that have occurred during the plague years reveal how quickly nature can begin to reclaim spaces that human activity had dominated, and you observe the return of wildlife to abandoned urban areas, the regrowth of vegetation in places where it had been eliminated by development, the improvement in air and water quality that has resulted from reduced industrial activity, and you understand that the plague has inadvertently provided a glimpse of what the world might look like if human population and economic activity were maintained at lower levels. And you see how these environmental improvements have influenced some survivors to advocate for maintaining smaller communities and less intensive resource use even as recovery makes higher population densities and increased consumption possible again. And you remember the environmental problems that existed before the plague and wonder whether the disaster might ultimately benefit the planet by forcing humanity to adopt more sustainable practices, and you think about the moral complexity of a catastrophe that has caused enormous human suffering while also providing environmental benefits that might prevent even greater future suffering from ecological collapse. The question of how to remember and commemorate the plague years becomes increasingly important as immediate survival pressures diminish and communities have time to reflect on their experiences, and you participate in discussions about creating memorials, preserving records, and establishing traditions that will help future generations understand what happened and why it mattered. And you understand that the way societies remember catastrophic events influences how they prepare for and respond to future challenges, and you see how different communities are developing different narratives about the plague that emphasize different lessons and values, and you remember learning about how previous disasters were remembered and how those memories shaped subsequent social and political development. And you think about what lessons from the plague years are most important to preserve and how those lessons can be transmitted effectively to people who did not live through the experience themselves. The realization that the plague has fundamentally and permanently changed human civilization becomes clear as recovery efforts reveal that many aspects of the pre-plague world cannot and perhaps should not be recreated, and you understand that survival has required not just enduring the disease but also accepting that the future will be different from the past in ways that are both better and worse than what existed before, and you see how the plague has served as a watershed moment that divides human history into before and after periods that can never be fully bridged. And you remember the confidence that people once had about controlling their destiny and shaping the future according to their desires, and how that confidence has been replaced by a more humble acceptance of uncertainty and the need to adapt to circumstances beyond human control. And you think about how this change in perspective might actually be beneficial if it leads to more realistic and sustainable approaches to social organization and resource use. The personal transformation that you have undergone during the plague years reflects broader changes in human consciousness that have affected everyone who survived the catastrophe, and you recognize that you are fundamentally different from the person you were before the plague, not just in terms of skills and knowledge but in your basic understanding of what matters in life and how human beings should relate to each other and to the natural world. And you understand that this transformation is both a loss of innocence and a gain of wisdom that comes from experiencing the fragility of everything that people normally take for granted, and you see how the plague has forced survivors to confront fundamental questions about mortality, meaning, and responsibility that most people in normal times can avoid thinking about, and you remember the dreams and ambitions that motivated you before the plague and how different your current goals and priorities are from what once seemed important. And you think about whether the changes in yourself and other survivors represent progress or regression in human development, and whether future generations will benefit or suffer from inheriting a world shaped by people who have been traumatized by catastrophic loss. The gradual acceptance that the plague experience has become part of who you are rather than something that you will eventually get over marks a final stage in the psychological recovery process, and you understand that healing does not mean returning to your previous state but rather integrating the trauma into a new identity that encompasses both the suffering you have endured and the strength you have developed, and you see how this acceptance allows you to move forward with purpose and hope, while maintaining respect for the magnitude of what you and others have experienced, and you remember believing that people should be able to put difficult experiences behind them and return to normal life. And you realize that some experiences are so profound that they become permanent parts of a person's identity, and that acknowledging this reality is essential for genuine healing and continued growth. And you think about how the plague has created a new category of human experience that will influence literature, philosophy, and social thought for generations as survivors and their descendants try to understand and communicate what they have learned about human nature and the possibilities for civilization. In the quiet moments of evening, when the immediate work of survival and recovery can be set aside temporarily, you reflect on the enormous journey that has brought you from the confident young woman who arrived in Philadelphia with dreams of modern city life to the weathered survivor who now helps lead a community of people bound together by shared trauma and mutual dependence. And you understand that this transformation represents both personal growth and historical change, as the plague has forced an entire generation to mature quickly and develop capabilities that previous generations never needed. And you see how your own story connects to the larger story of human adaptation and resilience that has enabled the species to survive countless disasters and continue evolving in response to changing circumstances. And you remember the ancestors who survived famines, wars, and plagues in previous centuries, and how their experiences contributed to the knowledge and traditions that helped you navigate your own catastrophe. And you think about the descendants who will inherit the world that you and other survivors are creating, and how they will judge the choices that seemed necessary or inevitable under the extreme conditions that the plague created. The recognition that humanity has survived this catastrophe and will continue to survive future challenges provides a foundation for the quiet optimism that characterizes healthy post-plague communities, and you understand that this optimism is different from the confident progressivism that characterized pre-plague society, because it is based on demonstrated resilience rather than assumed superiority over natural forces. And you see how the plague has taught survivors to appreciate human achievements while maintaining humility about human limitations and the need for cooperation with rather than domination of the natural world. And you remember the hubris that characterized much of pre-plague culture and how destructive it seems in retrospect compared to the more balanced perspective that has emerged among people who have witnessed the complete failure of technological and institutional solutions to prevent catastrophic suffering. And you think about how this hard-won wisdom might help future generations avoid some of the mistakes that contributed to the vulnerability that made the plague so devastating when it finally arrived. As sleep comes to you in your small room in the rebuilt community that has emerged from the ruins of plague-ravaged Philadelphia, you carry with you the knowledge that you have participated in one of the great tests of human adaptability, and that you have contributed to the ongoing story of human survival that stretches back to the earliest days of the species and will continue long after your own brief existence has ended. And you understand that the suffering you have endured and the strength you have developed are part of a larger pattern of challenge and response that has shaped human evolution and will continue to shape it as future generations face their own catastrophes and opportunities. And you see how your individual story connects to the universal human experience of struggling to create meaning and maintain dignity under impossible circumstances. And you remember the people who died during the plague years and how their sacrifice has contributed to whatever wisdom and resilience the survivors have gained. And you think about the responsibility that comes with survival and the obligation to honor the memory of the dead by using the knowledge purchased with their lives to create something worthy of their suffering, and something that might help future generations face their own challenges with greater wisdom and preparation than was available when the Great Plague of 1918 swept across the world and changed everything forever. The dawn of your second year as a plague survivor brings with it a responsibility you never anticipated, as younger members of your community begin to look to you and other long-term survivors for guidance about how to navigate a world that bears little resemblance to the one that existed before the Great Dying, and you find yourself serving as both teacher and student in a process of collective learning that has no precedent in human history. And you understand that the knowledge you have gained through suffering and adaptation must somehow be codified and transmitted to people who lack your direct experience but who will inherit the world that your decisions and actions are creating. and you see how the plague has accelerated social evolution by compressing what would normally take generations of gradual change into a few years of intense transformation that has left survivors struggling to understand their own experiences while simultaneously having to make choices that will determine the future direction of human civilization. The arrival of the first organized government representatives your community has seen since the early days of the plague creates both hope and anxiety as you recognize that reconnection with larger political structures might provide resources and stability while also threatening the autonomy and unique culture that your survivor community has developed through necessity and experimentation, and you participate in tense negotiations about how to balance local self-governance with participation in whatever new political arrangements are emerging from the ruins of the old federal system, and you understand that these discussions represent a fundamental tension between the intimate cooperative relationships that small-scale survival required and the more formal hierarchical structures that large-scale organization seems to demand, and you see how the plague has created communities that are in some ways more democratic and egalitarian than what existed before, but also more fragile and dependent on personal relationships that might not scale effectively to larger populations. And you remember the casual cynicism that people once expressed about government and politics and how much more serious and consequential such issues seem when the survival of your community depends on making the right choices about cooperation and resistance. The establishment of regular trade routes between survivor settlements brings both opportunities and dangers that force your community to develop new strategies for managing contact with outsiders while protecting the health and security that you have worked so hard to achieve, and you help design protocols for commerce that minimize the risk of introducing new diseases or social conflicts while maximizing the benefits of exchanging resources and information with communities that have developed different survival strategies and accumulated different types of knowledge, and you understand that these trade relationships represent the foundation for whatever new economic system will emerge from the plague years. And you see how the experience of scarcity and mutual dependence has created survivor communities that are both more generous in sharing resources and more careful about protecting what they have built. And you remember the competitive individualism that characterized pre-plague economic life and wonder whether the cooperative habits that survival necessitated can be maintained as abundance returns and people have more options for pursuing individual interests rather than collective welfare. The discovery of a cache of pre-plague books and documents in an abandoned library provides your community with an unexpected opportunity to reconnect with the intellectual and cultural traditions that seemed lost forever during the worst years of social collapse, and you spend hours reading works that remind you of the complexity and sophistication of the civilization that the plague destroyed while also recognizing how many of the assumptions and values expressed in these texts seem naive or irrelevant given what you now know about human vulnerability and the fragility of social institutions. And you understand that recovery involves not just rebuilding physical infrastructure but also deciding which aspects of pre-plague culture deserve to be preserved and which should be abandoned in favor of new approaches that reflect the lessons learned through catastrophic experience. And you see how the plague has created a generation of survivors who are uniquely positioned to evaluate past achievements and failures because they have witnessed both the heights of human accomplishment and the depths of social breakdown, and you think about the enormous responsibility that comes with serving as a bridge between the lost world of the past and the uncertain world of the future. The first wedding ceremony held in your community since the plague years marks a milestone in social recovery that goes far beyond the personal happiness of the couple involved, and you participate in creating new rituals and traditions that honor both the hope for future life and the memory of all those who died before they could experience such joy. And you understand that these celebrations represent acts of faith in human continuity that help heal the collective trauma of witnessing so much death and destruction, and you see how the plague has made survivors simultaneously more aware of life's fragility and more determined to create meaning and beauty despite uncertainty about what the future might hold. And you remember the elaborate social ceremonies that characterized pre-plague life and how different they seem compared to the more intimate and meaningful celebrations that have emerged among people who have learned to value human connection over material display. And you think about how catastrophic experiences can strip away superficial aspects of culture while strengthening the fundamental human needs for love, commitment, and shared celebration that help communities maintain hope and purpose across generations. The birth of the first children conceived after the plague creates a new category of hope and anxiety as your community struggles to provide adequate care for infants in a world where medical knowledge is limited and resources remain scarce, and you participate in collective efforts to ensure that these children receive the nutrition and protection they need while recognizing that their survival depends not just on individual care but on the stability and success of the entire community. And you Understand that these children represent both the future of human civilization and living symbols of the possibility that life can triumph over death even under the most challenging circumstances. And you see how the plague has made reproduction feel both more precious and more frightening, because survivors understand how easily life can be lost and how much responsibility comes with bringing new people into a world that offers no guarantees of safety or prosperity. And you remember taking for granted the routine nature of childbirth and child rearing in the pre-plague world, and how miraculous these processes seem when viewed from the perspective of people who have witnessed the near extinction of their entire civilization. The gradual re-establishment of basic medical care through a combination of recovered knowledge, improvised techniques, and careful experimentation represents one of the most important achievements of your survivor community, and you help train people in simple treatments and preventive measures while recognizing that the sophisticated medical system that existed before the plague cannot be recreated without the infrastructure and specialized knowledge that were lost when most healthcare professionals died during the epidemic. And you understand that post-plague medicine must focus on prevention and basic care rather than the complex interventions that characterized pre-plague healthcare, and you see how this limitation has led to a more holistic approach to health that emphasizes nutrition, sanitation and community support rather than technological solutions to medical problems. And you remember the confidence that people once placed in medical science and how much more humble and realistic survivor communities have become about what human knowledge can achieve in the face of natural forces that remain largely beyond our control or understanding. The seasonal cycles that mark the passage of time provide a natural framework for planning and reflection that helps your community maintain perspective about both immediate challenges and long-term goals, and you participate in harvest celebrations that acknowledge both the abundance that careful farming has produced and the uncertainty that still characterizes every aspect of post-plague existence. And you understand that these rhythms connect survivors to natural processes that preceded human civilization and will continue long after whatever new civilization emerges from the plague years has run its course. And you see how the plague has forced people to rediscover their dependence on natural systems and seasonal patterns that modern technology had seemed to make irrelevant. And you remember the artificial environments and controlled conditions that characterized much of pre-plague urban life and how disconnected they seem compared to the more integrated relationship with natural processes that survival has required. And you think about whether this reconnect with natural rhythms represents a temporary necessity that will be abandoned as technology recovers, or a permanent change in human consciousness that might help prevent future catastrophes by reducing the hubris that contributed to pre-plague vulnerability. The emergence of new forms of artistic expression among plague survivors reflects the human need to process traumatic experiences through creative work that can communicate what cannot be expressed through ordinary language or rational analysis. And you contribute to collective projects that combine visual art, music, and storytelling in ways that help the community understand and integrate the meaning of what you have all experienced together. And you understand that these artistic efforts serve both therapeutic and historical functions by providing outlets for emotional processing while also creating records that might help future generations understand what the plague years were like for the people who lived through them. And you see how catastrophic experiences can inspire creativity that is both more authentic and more powerful than what emerges during peaceful times, because it is grounded in direct confrontation with fundamental questions about mortality, meaning, and human relationships. And you remember the entertainment and cultural products that characterized pre-plague society and how superficial they seem compared to the art that has emerged from genuine suffering and hard-won wisdom about what matters most in human existence. The question of how to educate children who have no memory of the pre-plague world becomes increasingly complex as these young people develop their own perspectives on what they observe around them and begin to ask questions that challenge assumptions that survivors have developed through their traumatic experiences. And you participate in discussions about how to balance honesty about the dangers and uncertainties of post-plague life with the need to give children hope and confidence that their futures can be better than their past. And you understand that education in survivor communities must prepare young people for a world that is fundamentally different from anything that previous generations experienced, while also transmitting values and knowledge that might help them avoid repeating the mistakes that contributed to the original catastrophe. And you see how the plague has created a unique educational challenge because traditional approaches to learning were designed for stable societies with predictable futures, while post-plague education must prepare people for uncertainty and change while maintaining the cultural continuity that gives human life meaning and purpose. The gradual restoration of written communication between distant communities provides your first reliable information about how the plague affected other parts of the country and the world, and you learn that the patterns of death and survival that you witnessed locally were repeated everywhere with variations that depended on specific geographic, economic, and social conditions. And you understand that the plague was truly a global catastrophe that permanently altered human civilization rather than a regional disaster that might be overcome through outside assistance. And you see how the reports from other survivor communities confirm some of your assumptions about post-plague recovery while challenging others and providing new ideas about approaches to rebuilding that your community had not considered. And you remember the global interconnectedness that characterized pre-plague society and how isolated and provincial life seems when communication depends on letters that take weeks to travel between communities rather than instant electronic connections that once made distant places seem as accessible as neighboring towns. The development of new governance structures that can handle conflicts and decisions within your survivor community requires balancing democratic principles with the practical realities of life in a small group where personal relationships and individual contributions matter more than abstract rights or formal procedures, and you participate in creating systems that emphasize consensus and cooperation while still providing mechanisms for making difficult decisions when consensus cannot be achieved. And you understand that post-plague governance represents an experiment in social organization that has no perfect models to follow because the circumstances that survivor communities face are unprecedented in human history. And you see how the plague has created opportunities to address some of the inequalities and inefficiencies that characterized pre-plague political systems while also revealing new sources of conflict and disagreement that arise when people must make collective decisions about survival under conditions of scarcity and uncertainty. And you think about whether the political innovations that emerge from survivor communities might provide better approaches to governance than what existed before, or whether human nature will eventually recreate the same problems that contributed to pre-plague social instability. The realization that you have become an elder and leader in your community despite being only in your 20s reflects how the plague has compressed normal social development and forced young people to assume responsibilities that would typically belong to older, more experienced individuals. And you recognize that your authority derives not from age or formal credentials but from the demonstrated ability to survive impossible circumstances and help others do the same, and you understand that this represents a fundamental change in how leadership is conceived and legitimated in post-plague society, and you see how the catastrophe has created new forms of expertise based on direct experience with crisis management and community building rather than academic knowledge or inherited status. And you remember the complex hierarchies and credentialing systems that determined authority in pre-plague society and how irrelevant they seem compared to the more practical and results-oriented approaches to leadership that have emerged among survivors. And you think about whether these changes represent permanent improvements in how societies organize themselves or temporary adaptations that will be abandoned as more normal conditions return. The ongoing health effects that many plague survivors continue to experience create new categories of disability and chronic illness that your community must learn to accommodate within the framework of a society where everyone's contribution is essential for collective survival. And you work to develop support systems for people whose capacity for physical labor has been permanently reduced while finding ways to utilize their knowledge and experience in roles that match their capabilities. And you understand that post-plague society cannot afford to waste human resources but also cannot ignore the reality that many survivors need ongoing care and assistance that diverts energy from other essential activities. And you see how this challenge has led to more inclusive and flexible approaches to work and social participation than existed in pre-plague society, where disabled people were often marginalized or excluded from productive roles. And you remember the competitive individualism that made pre-plague society hostile to people who could not maintain standard levels of productivity. And you think about how the shared experience of vulnerability and interdependence has created survivor communities that are more accepting of human limitations while also more creative about finding ways for everyone to contribute according to their abilities. The question of whether to attempt to re-establish contact with survivors in other countries becomes a focus of debate as your community develops the resources and capabilities that might make such ambitious projects possible, and you participate in discussions about whether international reconnection should be a priority given the enormous challenges that still exist at the local and regional level. And you understand that these debates reflect different visions of what post-plague recovery should prioritize and whether survivor communities have obligations that extend beyond their immediate members to include the broader human family that was shattered by the catastrophe. And you see how the plague has created tension between the tribal loyalty that was essential for small group survival and the more universal humanitarianism that characterized pre-plague idealism. And you remember the confident internationalism that existed before the plague and how naive it seems given the practical difficulties of maintaining cooperation even within individual communities where people share direct experience and immediate common interests. The establishment of workshops and training programs designed to preserve and transmit essential skills represents your community's commitment to maintaining technological capabilities that might otherwise be lost as older survivors who possess pre-plague knowledge die or become unable to continue working, and you participate in efforts to document techniques for metalworking, construction, agriculture, and other practical activities while also training younger people who can carry on these traditions. And you understand that this knowledge preservation represents a race against time because the window for transferring pre-plague expertise is rapidly closing as the number of people who worked in complex technological systems before the catastrophe continues to decline. And you see how the plague has revealed the vulnerability of technological civilization to the loss of skilled practitioners who maintain systems that most people take for granted, and you remember the confidence that people once placed in written manuals and formal education as means of preserving knowledge, and you realize that much essential knowledge exists only in the hands and minds of experienced practitioners who cannot easily transfer their expertise to others without extended periods of direct apprenticeship and collaboration. The gradual recovery of musical and artistic traditions provides emotional and cultural benefits that prove to be as important for community health as advances in medicine or agriculture, and you participate in organizing performances and exhibitions that help maintain connections to pre-plague culture while also encouraging new forms of creative expression that reflect post-plague experiences and values. And you understand that these activities serve essential social functions by providing outlets for emotions that cannot be expressed through ordinary conversation and by creating shared experiences that strengthen community bonds. And you see how the plague has made survivors more appreciative of beauty and creativity because they understand how easily such things can be lost and how much they contribute to what makes life worth living beyond mere biological survival. And you remember the commercial entertainment industry that existed before the plague and how artificial it seems compared to the more authentic and participatory cultural activities that have emerged in survivor communities where everyone contributes to and benefits from artistic expression rather than passively consuming products created by distant professionals. The development of new rituals and ceremonies that help your community mark important transitions and acknowledge shared experiences represents an ongoing process of cultural creation that reflects the unique circumstances and values of post-plague society, and you contribute to designing observances that honor the memory of plague victims while celebrating the resilience of survivors and expressing hope for future generations. And you understand that these rituals serve important psychological and social functions by providing frameworks for processing grief and trauma while also reinforcing community identity and shared commitment to mutual support. And you see how the plague has created the need for new forms of spiritual and emotional expression because traditional religious and cultural practices were designed for societies that had not experienced such massive loss and transformation. And you remember the elaborate ceremonial life that characterized pre-plague society and how much of it now seems either irrelevant or inappropriate for people who have witnessed the complete collapse of the world they once knew. The recognition that your survivor community has developed distinctive characteristics and capabilities that might serve as models for other recovering societies creates both pride and responsibility as you realize that your experimental approaches to social organization, resource management, and conflict resolution might have implications beyond your immediate circumstances. And you participate in efforts to document and share innovations that have proven successful while also learning from the experiences of other communities that have developed different solutions to similar challenges. And you understand that this exchange of ideas and practices represents a crucial element of broader social recovery because it allows successful innovations to spread while preventing communities from repeating mistakes that others have already identified and corrected. And you see how the plague has created opportunities for social experimentation that might never have occurred under normal circumstances because the complete breakdown of existing institutions has forced survivors to invent new approaches to fundamental problems of human organization and cooperation. the question of how to prepare for future catastrophes becomes increasingly important as your community achieves sufficient stability to think beyond immediate survival needs, and you participate in planning efforts designed to ensure that whatever new civilization emerges from the plague years will be more resilient and better prepared to handle similar challenges than the society that was destroyed by the 1918 pandemic. And you understand that this preparation requires not just stockpiling resources and developing technical capabilities but also maintaining institutional knowledge and cultural memory about how societies can adapt and respond when their basic assumptions about safety and stability are proven wrong. And you see how the plague has provided harsh but valuable lessons about the importance of redundancy, decentralization, and social cooperation that might help prevent future catastrophes from having such devastating effects, and you remember the confidence that pre-plague society placed in centralized systems and specialized institutions, and you think about how the experience of total system failure has revealed the advantages of more distributed and flexible approaches to organizing essential services and maintaining social resilience. As you settle into sleep in your rebuilt room in a community that has emerged stronger and wiser from the ashes of plague-devastated Philadelphia, you carry with you the profound understanding that you have witnessed and participated in one of the great transformative events in human history, and you know that the lessons learned through unimaginable suffering and loss have created new possibilities for human civilization that might never have emerged without the catalyst of catastrophic challenge, and you understand that your generation of survivors bears the responsibility of ensuring that the wisdom purchased with so much death and trauma is not lost but instead becomes the foundation for building a world that is more just, more resilient, and more conscious of the interconnections between human welfare and the health of the natural systems that support all life. And you see how the plague has forced humanity to confront fundamental questions about purpose, meaning, and responsibility that comfortable societies can often avoid. And you think about the children who will inherit the world you are creating and whether they will understand and appreciate the enormous cost at which their opportunities were purchased, and you feel both the weight of survival and the lightness of hope as you recognize that every dawn brings new possibilities for healing, growth, and the continued evolution of human consciousness in response to whatever challenges and opportunities the future may hold.